All right, so we're diving into a case today that seemed pretty open and shut at first, but it took some pretty crazy turns. This is
Hmm.
the death of Kimberly Casses Rivera.
Yeah.
She was a New York City police officer
Hmm.
found with a gunshot wound to the head.
Right.
And it looked like a suicide, like a really tragic suicide.
Right.
But as we dig into the court testimonies and police reports, and we've even got some interviews,
Yeah.
you'll see that things are not always as they appear.
Not at all. Not at all. And what I think is so interesting about this case is how it really shows the limits of those, first impressions. When you
Right.
see a scene, you think, okay, I know what happened here,
Yeah.
but you don't.
Yeah.
So the scene itself, Kimberly was found on the street next to her car, gun in hand.
Oh, wow.
And her 8-month-old son was still inside the car.
Oh, my gosh.
So, it really did look like a picture of despair.
Yeah.
But the details, especially knowing who Kimberly was and her background,
Right.
really raised some red flags immediately.
Right, because she was a police officer.
Yeah.
So that brings in the DA's office right from the get-go.
Yes,
I imagine that's standard procedure, right?
of course. Yeah.
To avoid any conflicts of interest.
Any appearance of impropriety.
Right, exactly.
Right.
But were investigators suspicious of John Rivera's story even at that point?
You're hitting on a really, really crucial point.
Okay.
So while the scene itself seemed to back up John's claim that this was a suicide, the DA's office wanted to be absolutely sure,
Sure.
and they requested a gunshot residue test on John.
Okay.
But interestingly enough, his lawyer refused.
Now, that's interesting to me.
Yeah.
I mean, gunshot residue tests, I know they're not foolproof,
Mm-hmm.
but wouldn't it have been in his best interest to just clear his name right away?
That's where the science gets a little bit difficult.
Okay.
So while gunshot residue can indicate that somebody fired a weapon,
Right.
it's not always 100% conclusive.
Oh, okay.
So things like the type of firearm used, weather conditions, even how much time has passed since the shot was fired can really affect the results.
Oh, okay.
So John's lawyer's refusal to allow that testing, while it did raise eyebrows, it wasn't totally unfounded.
I see.
There was a legal basis for pushing back on that.
Okay. So we've got what seems like an open and shut case, but there are these little inconsistencies.
Yeah,
What happened next? Did the investigation just hit a wall?
not quite. This is where Dr. Jonathan Arden comes in.
Okay.
He was the chief medical examiner at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and his autopsy findings completely changed the direction of the investigation.
Okay, so let's get into those findings. What did Dr. Arden discover that
Yeah.
was so important?
So first of all, the shape of Kimberly's wound was not typical for a self-inflicted gunshot wound.
Okay.
It was what's called a keyhole wound, which is like a round entry point with a little slot at the bottom.
Oh, okay.
And you just don't see that very often in suicides.
Mm-hmm.
And then came the real shocker. They found gunshot residue on Kimberly's thumb, but in a pattern that wasn't consistent with her firing the weapon.
That's huge. So the suicide theory is starting to fall apart here.
Exactly.
Okay.
So to be extra sure, they did what's called white glove testing,
Okay.
which basically means you fire the gun, Kimberly's gun,
Right.
multiple times using the same ammunition.
Mm-hmm.
See if you get that same residue pattern on the thumb.
Wow.
And no matter how many times they fired it, they couldn't match that pattern.
Hmm.
So based on this and all the other evidence that was gathered, Dr. Arden officially ruled Kimberly's death a homicide.
Wow. This case is getting more and more complex.
Yeah.
So with suicide ruled out, obviously the focus shifts to John Rivera, the husband.
Right.
What was his background like? What kind of guy was he?
So initially, John was really portrayed as this kind of hero, someone who had saved lives during a fire and even gotten a medal from the mayor for his actions.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But as investigators dug deeper, they found a much more troubled picture.
Okay, so we've got a heroic facade, but it's concealing something a little darker.
Yeah, exactly.
What kind of troubles are we talking about?
Well, John had a history of really volatile behavior and a quick temper. And this had led to, job losses. And even more concerning, Kimberly had actually filed an order of protection against him just months before she died.
Oh, an order of protection. That's really serious.
Yeah.
So that definitely raises some red flags about their relationship.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It suggests that she was afraid of him and there may have been a pattern of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
But what makes John's character even more complex
Okay.
was that he had this, I guess you'd call it an obsession with the police.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He actually owned a full NYPD uniform.
No way.
He had fake badges.
Wow.
He even went to a police convention in disguise.
Wow. It's like he was living a double life.
Yeah, he was really fascinated by law enforcement.
So what was it about the police that was so fascinating to him?
You know, that's a great question, and one that I think is really worth thinking about. This obsession, it could have been rooted in this desire for power, for control, something that he may have lacked in other parts of his life.
I see.
And when you consider that he actually met Kimberly, who was a police officer,
Right.
through a motorcycle group,
Okay.
it makes you wonder if her badge was part of the reason he was attracted to her in the first place.
That's a fascinating psychological angle to this.
Yeah.
So we've got a potentially volatile relationship, an order of protection, and this unusual fascination with law enforcement.
Right.
But did investigators find anything that concretely linked John to the crime scene?
So when they searched John's apartment,
Okay.
they found the original box for Kimberly's gun
Oh, wow.
and extra grips for the gun,
Okay.
even though the gun was registered in her name.
Mm-hmm.
And this discovery showed that John had made some very calculated moves.
Right.
That raised some serious questions about what his intentions really were.
Hold on. If it was her gun, why did he have that stuff at his place?
Yeah, right.
How did he even get her firearm in the first place?
Well, that's where things get even more twisted.
Okay.
So the gun had originally belonged to another police officer who had passed away, a friend of John's.
Okay.
And after his friend died, somehow John convinced the officer's father to transfer ownership of the gun to Kimberly
Whoa.
so that he would have access to it.
So this wasn't some like spur of the moment thing. It sounds like he was really pulling strings behind the scenes.
Yeah, it paints a very different picture than that grieving husband that he was presenting himself as.
Right.
And this manipulation wasn't just about the gun.
Okay.
Remember that order of protection that Kimberly filed?
Right.
It turns out that John had been making direct threats to kill her.
Oh my gosh.
He told her divorce lawyer.
Really?
And he also told a coworker.
Wow. So the threat was very real
Yeah.
and other people knew about it.
Yes.
Did anything happen with those threats before Kimberly's death?
Sadly, yes.
Okay.
There was an incident where John confronted Kimberly and a friend in a park.
Okay.
And this was a direct violation of the order of protection, which led to him getting arrested.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're seeing this pattern of escalating behavior here, this disregard for the law,
Yeah.
and a very real danger to Kimberly.
Yes.
But was there any evidence that linked these threats directly to her death? Like beyond just his words?
So during the search of Kimberly's apartment, investigators found something that seemed really insignificant at first.
Okay.
It was an old answering machine.
It's an answering machine. Like with the tape.
Yes.
Wow, those are like ancient artifacts these days.
I know.
Does it even have anything useful on it?
Well, that was the challenge.
Okay.
The tape had all these messages, some recorded over other messages.
Oh, I see.
It was a total technological nightmare.
So how did they even get any information from that? That sounds like a forensic needle in a haystack.
You know, they needed some serious help. So they turned to the FBI,
Oh, wow.
the forensic lab at Quantico.
Okay.
They're known for audio analysis,
Yeah.
and they worked really, really hard to get any usable messages off that tape.
And I'm guessing their effort paid off.
It was a game changer.
Yeah.
Buried within all that noise and all those voices was a message from John.
Really?
A voicemail that he had left for Kimberly shortly after that incident in the park.
Oh, wow.
And it was just filled with rage.
Oh, no.
Threats. You could just hear the anger in his voice.
Well, that voicemail must have been crucial.
It was.
It connected his state of mind to her death.
It was a direct link.
Wow.
And it really cemented the prosecution's case.
Yeah.
So much so that they charged John with both intentional murder and depraved murder.
Now, I get intentional murder,
Right.
but what is depraved murder?
So depraved murder doesn't require that you prove intent to kill.
Okay.
It's more about showing that the person's actions were so reckless
Oh, I see.
and so dangerous that they showed a callous disregard for human life.
So in John's case, they were arguing that even if he didn't go there intending to kill her, that his actions leading up to it, the fact that he brought a gun,
Right.
that he threatened her,
Right.
violated the order of protection,
Yeah,
that was enough to be considered depraved murder.
exactly.
Oh.
And back then it was pretty common for prosecutors to charge both just to give the jury some options.
I see.
They didn't care which one stuck as long as he was held accountable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
So it sounds like they had a really strong case. What was Ken's theory about what happened that night based on all this evidence?
Ken believed that Kimberly went to pick up their son from John,
Okay.
And he thought that she probably had already strapped the baby into the car seat.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when John, driven by his anger over the legal stuff and
Yeah.
his loss of control, confronted her.
So it was like a heated argument,
Yeah.
a loaded gun,
Yeah.
and just a horrible outcome.
A really tragic situation.
It sounds like all the pieces were starting to come together.
Mm-hmm.
What happened as the case moved towards trial?
So the trial lasted for several weeks.
Okay.
And as you can imagine, it was really tense.
Yeah.
Very emotional for everybody involved.
I bet. I mean, a trial like that, it's got to be draining.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And at one point, one of the jurors actually got sick
Oh.
and had to be hospitalized, which delayed things even further.
Oh, man. That must have been really stressful for everybody.
It was a lot to handle.
What happened with the juror? Did she recover?
Thankfully, yes.
Oh, good.
She was able to rejoin the deliberations.
Okay.
And finally, after weeks of testimony and going over all the evidence, the verdict came in.
Okay. I'm on the edge of my seat here. What did the jury decide? Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What did the jury decide?
The jury found John guilty of depraved murder.
Wow, that must have been a huge relief for everybody who had been fighting for justice for Kimberly.
Yeah, it really seemed like a victory,
Yeah.
a testament to all the hard work of the investigators and the prosecutors.
Yeah.
John was sentenced to 23 years to life,
Wow.
which, seems like a sentence that really fits the gravity of his crime.
Right.
But this case, with all its twists and turns, it had one final surprise in store.
Wait, what do you mean? It sounded like a solid conviction, a pretty clear-cut case of justice being served. What happened?
Well, John's lawyers, they weren't done fighting.
Okay.
They appealed his case.
Okay.
And while he lost those first appeals, the state appeals, they took it a step further
Okay.
and filed a motion in federal court.
A federal appeal.
Yeah.
That's pretty unusual, right?
Yeah.
What were their grounds for appealing at that level?
Okay, so they argued that there was a legal technicality
Okay.
in how the charges had been applied.
Okay.
So you remember how John was charged with both intentional murder and depraved murder?
Yes, and the jury convicted him of depraved murder.
Right, and
Yeah.
that's where the technicality comes in.
Yeah.
John's lawyers, they basically said that if he was guilty of any murder at all, it was intentional murder.
Well,
Therefore, the depraved murder conviction couldn't stand.
so they were basically saying that he was convicted of the wrong type of murder.
It's a really complicated legal argument.
Yeah.
It really hinges on this very nuanced interpretation of New York law.
Mm-hmm.
But a 3-judge panel, they agreed with them,
Wow.
and they overturned the conviction.
Are you serious? So after all that, after the trial, the evidence, the jury's decision, John Rivera was set free because of a technicality.
It's hard to believe.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what happened.
Wow.
And it was just devastating for Kimberly's family.
Yeah.
A huge setback for the prosecution.
It must have been crushing for everyone who had been fighting so hard for justice.
It was.
What was the impact of that decision, like on the people involved?
Well, it was a really dark time. Kimberly's lawyer, she was actually so terrified of John that she considered closing her practice and leaving New York State.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, and Kimberly's family, they were really worried that John would try to get custody of their son,
Right.
who had some disabilities and really needed special care.
It sounds like the very real fear that Kimberly had lived with. The reason she filed that order of protection. That fear now extended to everyone she left behind.
It did.
Did they have any legal recourse at that point? Was there any way to challenge this federal ruling?
So Ken, despite this huge setback,
Yeah.
he was determined to see justice served.
Good for him.
He was not going to let a technicality allow a killer to walk free.
Mm-hmm.
So he reached out to Lenny Joblo, who was this brilliant legal mind heading up the appeals bureau at the time.
Okay.
Lenny had this reputation for, finding creative solutions within the law.
Right.
And Ken was really hoping that he could find a way to challenge this seemingly impossible decision.
So there was a glimmer of hope, a chance to right this wrong.
Maybe.
What did Lenny do to try and overturn it?
So Lenny, he studied the case really carefully.
Yeah.
He looked at the federal court's reasoning
Yeah.
and the specific legal precedents that they cited.
Mm-hmm.
And he realized that their decision was based on this very narrow interpretation of New York law.
Okay.
And he thought that maybe, just maybe, that could be challenged.
So it was a long shot.
It was a long shot.
Yeah.
But with Lenny's expertise and his determination,
Right.
maybe there was a path forward.
Yeah.
So what Lenny did was he decided to write what's called a brief.
Yeah.
It's like a really detailed legal argument.
Right.
And he submitted it to the same 3 judges who had overturned the conviction.
Wow. He took the argument back to the same judges who had already ruled against him.
He did.
What was the response? Did they even agree to reconsider the case?
You know, sometimes the most unexpected things happen in the pursuit of justice.
Okay.
The judges actually agreed to hear Lenny's arguments. Wow.
And to reconsider their initial ruling.
Okay, so the door was open, at least,
Yeah.
for the possibility of reversing this whole thing.
Yeah.
But what were the chances that these judges, after they'd already made a ruling,
Yeah.
that they would change their minds based on this brief?
It was a nail-biter for sure.
Yeah.
But Lenny's he's brilliant. And
Yeah.
his deep understanding of the law, I think it really paid off in the end.
Are you saying that they actually reversed their previous ruling?
In a really stunning turn of events.
Wow.
They did. The federal court, convinced by Lenny's arguments, they reinstated John Rivera's conviction.
Wow. That is amazing. It's like the legal equivalent of a Hail Mary pass.
I know.
What was the reaction to that?
Oh, it was just this huge sense of vindication and relief.
Yeah.
John remained in prison where he belonged,
Right.
and justice, even though it took a long and winding road,
Yeah.
was ultimately served.
So the story could have ended there.
Yeah. John's back in prison.
Right.
Convictions reinstated.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier that Ken wasn't quite finished yet.
No, he wasn't.
What else did he do to make sure that justice was really served?
Even with John back behind bars, Ken knew that eventually he would be eligible for parole.
Right.
And he was determined to do everything he could to prevent John from ever being released.
Wow.
And potentially harming anyone else.
That's amazing. Going above and beyond even after the conviction was secured.
Yeah.
What did he do to try and influence that parole board's decision?
Ken really meticulously compiled these really detailed letters,
Yeah.
just outlining all the evidence against John, highlighting his history of violence, how calculated his actions were,
Right.
and just the really devastating impact that his crimes had had on Kimberly's family.
Right.
He wanted to make sure that that parole board had a really clear and unflinching picture of the man they were considering for release.
So he wasn't going to rest until he knew that John wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else.
Exactly.
It's like he took it upon himself to be a voice for Kimberly, to advocate for her even after her death.
He really did. And I think, Ken's commitment to justice, it went way beyond just securing a conviction.
Yeah.
It extended to actually protecting the community from this dangerous person.
Right, right.
He understood that true justice meant not just holding people accountable,
Yeah.
but actually preventing future harm.
This entire story has been such a roller coaster.
It has.
So many emotions,
Yeah.
legal complexities.
Yeah.
From that initial shock of Kimberly's death to all the twists and turns of the investigation, the trial, that shocking appeal, and then finally that reinstatement of the conviction. It's really captivating.
It is.
But beyond just the story itself, what are some of the key insights or takeaways you think listeners should be thinking about? It's been a wild ride with this case, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But you're right, there are layers here that go beyond just the whodunit.
Mm-hmm.
What stands out to you looking back on all of this?
Well, for me, this case just really drives home the importance of thoroughness.
Yeah.
From Dr. Arden's meticulous work on the autopsy
Mm-hmm.
to the FBI's painstaking audio analysis. And then, of course, Ken and Lenny's just relentless legal pursuit.
Right.
It just shows that every little detail matters.
Yeah. It also highlights, the complexities of the legal system, right?
Yes.
I mean, to think that John Rivera almost walked free because of a technicality?
Yeah.
Despite all that evidence against him.
Right.
It's a reminder that justice isn't always a straight line.
It's not. And this case really shows both, the power of having dedicated people working within the system.
Yeah.
But also how it can become this kind of labyrinth of procedures and interpretations, right? Without the tenacity of those involved. I mean, the outcome could have been totally different.
We've talked a lot about John Rivera's actions,
Yeah.
but I keep thinking about that obsession with the police.
Right.
Do you think that was just some strange quirk?
Mm-hmm.
Or could it have been connected to his motivations in this case somehow?
That is such a great question.
Yeah.
And I think it would be easy to dismiss it as just a weird thing.
Right.
But I do think it's worth considering that this fixation on law enforcement, on these symbols of authority and control,
Yeah.
might have been tied to his inability to control things in his own life.
Okay.
Like his relationships, his
So
emotions.
almost like a compensation kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like seeking power externally because he lacked it internally.
That's a really interesting way to look at it.
Yeah.
And maybe that sense of powerlessness is really what fueled his rage when Kimberly decided to leave him.
Right.
And that drove his action.
What happened to Kimberly's son? After everything that happened, who took care of him?
Well, Kimberly's sister, Stephanie, she stepped up and took on the responsibility of raising her nephew.
Oh, wow.
And it was a huge sacrifice.
Yeah,
But she provided him with a loving, stable home.
that's good to hear.
It's a way of honoring Kimberly's memory
Yeah,
in the most meaningful way.
that's a beautiful silver lining in all this darkness, knowing that Kimberly's son is surrounded by love and support.
It is, and I think it really speaks to the ripple effects of these kinds of events,
Yeah.
the impact on those left behind.
This case has raised so many questions, really thought-provoking questions that go beyond the crime itself. It makes you think about the darker parts of human nature.
Yeah.
The lengths that someone will go to hold on to control, how fragile life really is. What are you left thinking about after looking at all of this?
It's a reminder to me that behind the headlines and the legal arguments,
Mm-hmm.
these are real people,
Yeah.
real lives that are shattered by violence and loss.
Right.
And Kimberly's story just reminds us to be vigilant,
Yeah.
to pay attention to those red flags,
Oh.
to speak up if we think something is wrong.
Absolutely. And to support victims of domestic violence and their families.
Yes.
There are resources out there.
There are.
People who can help navigate these really dangerous situations.
Yeah, silence just allows that cycle of abuse to continue.
This deep dive has been a wild ride, to say the least.
It has.
Full of twists and turns I never would have predicted.
It's true.
The case of Kimberly Casses Rivera is just a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving.
Mm-hmm.
And that justice, even when it's hard to find,
Yeah,
is always worth fighting for.
it is.
Well, listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. What stood out to you? What questions are you still thinking about? Let's keep this conversation going. These are the kinds of stories that deserve to be discussed and analyzed and learned from.